Hello. I'm on. Hopefully, I didn't get to check the audio, but here we go. I'm Jeffrey. Every week, I teach you how to create a better yoga and mobility practice. And today, we're going to be talking about passive stretching. Now, passive stretching is like the mecca of all stretching. There are a ton of different ways to do, well, not there's a ton of different ways. Let's say there's a ton of different modalities and methods that utilize passive stretching as their main component, like their main jam for stretching. Most of us would consider passive stretching just stretching in general. Okay, so that's what we got today. Let's go to the pop quiz. Oh no. All right, well, I ruined it. The answer is up. I thought I took it down. But the quiz was, what is a term for taking a joint to the end of its available length? And the answer, obviously it's already up, is end range or passive end range. So, I mean, I'm really batting 1,000 today. I gave you the answer. Don't worry, I'm still new to this streaming. I'm getting it. So again, the question was, what is the term for taking a joint to the end of its available length? By the way, it's so hot out here today. That's part of the reason I'm going crazy. Is passive end range, or just end range in general. I would have taken that. That's a common term you might hear. End range, find your end range, find your passive end range. That's really what they're talking about, is the passive end range. All right, let's go to the schedule. What are we talking about today? What's today's session about? Obviously, it's passive stretching. That's the main focus of today. That's what we're going to be talking about. Then we have time under tension. We're going to be talking about what that means, how to put it together, how to use it. The cue myth, I got another cue we're going to look at. Is it a good cue? Is it a bad cue? And then we're going to go over the pose breakdown. I have two poses today. They're similar, and we're going to go over them passively, most likely. So that's where I'm going with all this. All right. I feel bad that I failed you on the on the pop quiz, but you still got the knowledge. So that's the important thing. Give me a second here. I'm just getting everything ready. Okay. All right, so let's talk about passive stretching. Before we talk about passive stretching, I want to take a moment and I want to talk about the book and what we use to really teach everything at Yoga Framework. So we're going to take a moment to talk about the book. This is the course book that we have, and this is pretty much where we get all the information from. We did put this together. There aren't a lot of yoga course books out there. This one's available on our website, yogaframework.com, and also available on amazon.com. So you can feel free to check this out. It's over like 230, almost 240 something pages. I don't know if it, 242, including the end, which is really important because out of all, like when you go to instructional books about fitness, for anybody just yoga, just fitness in general, it's not often you're finding an index and a glossary, like all books have. So, we really put the information here, the work in here, and we understand that textbooks need to read like textbooks. So if you want to make a course book in anything, you need to have an index and a glossary and a table of contents, and all has to be organized correctly and make sense. And that's what this is. And by the way, this isn't a book about me. It's not a book, and it's not even really a book about yoga so much. It is also about yoga, but a lot of the concepts in here apply to physical culture in general, movement culture, whatever you want to call it. It's the way we move. I like to call that yoga as well. I also have the Yoga Framework sequence deck. So this is really cool. You could take these cards, you can create sequences with them. I know there's other sequence decks out there. This one is unique. It's way more advanced. Out of the box, this one's sealed, but you can do these sequences. I don't know if you could read that. Sri Namaskar and all that stuff. So it's color coded on the cards on how to do that. You can put them and by number, and you know, it's kind of like a little bit like a poker card feel. I designed these. You know, these are all these products, by the way, are made by me and my associates, and you know, also my partner Sarah, who helped a lot. But these products are made by us, right? These are not. We didn't buy them from anywhere. We're not reselling them. So just so you know that. They're based on our education, our knowledge. Okay, back to passive stretching. Now, passive stretching, well, first, you know, I'm going to refer to the book. We're going to go right to the book. I'm going to teach you right from the book. And this is under chapter 13, 131, what is stretching? I know it seems like such a simple question, but is it? Do you really know what stretching is? Could you explain what a stretch was to someone else? I don't know. All right, let's talk about, well, let's go to the full screen actually for a minute. Okay, good. So in general, I explain stretching a few different ways. First, we talk about sacred geometry. Now, sacred geometry, I'm not going to go too in depth here, and it's you know, it's debatable what sacred geometry is because it's not Euclidean, or let's say the geometry, the definition is to measure the earth. Sacred geometry encompasses textbook Euclidean geometry, that's what most of us call regular geometry, while also incorporating a level of the philosophical or symbolical connotation to the forms, patterns, and relationships found in the geometric realm. So it's basically trying to tie in Euclidean geometry with your body and the things in the earth, which is common, right? You see geometric shapes and patterns all throughout the earth and your body, right? Pi and all these other measurements are all over your body. That kind of even goes down to, you know, the 108, the mala, all that stuff. It's all based on math. I know, that's why I love it too. If you do love it. I feel like I'm having a conversation with you. All right, so sacred geometry is what I use to find passive end range. And I'm not going to go too deep into the sacred geometry and how we do that and how we teach that. That's part of our training, or like I said, part of the book if you want to get it. But we basically use sacred geometry to determine where passive or end range is in the joint. So it helps you to determine that, and there are ways to do that. So using sacred geometry, we determine passive end range in the joints. And from that, we can begin a stretch. Because a stretch is something that's happening in the tissue. And passive end range is the beginning of that stretch. So if you don't know where passive end range is, you can't efficiently stretch. And this kind of begs the question, are most people even stretching? Do they know where passive end range is or what it is? I'm not saying they don't. But it's possible because you have to feel it in your body. So passive end range is the end of where the joint pretty much opens to. Now, what is passive? Let's see, well, let's go to the next part I want to go over. Passive end range, the textbook definition, can be defined as the accessible range of motion in the joint when an external force is directing the movement. It is usually the maximum range of motion. So passive end range, that full term, is defined as an external force moving the joint. That's what makes it passive. So that's why the question, the pop quiz, said end range, and it had passive in there because people say passive as well, and I would have accepted that even though I gave you the answer, but it said end range because passive end range is when, I'll read it one more time, when an external force is directing the movement. It's usually the maximum range of motion. And examples of this, a trainer or therapist manually moving a joint to its end range. So if you go to physical therapy or something like that and they take your arm and they move it up here and they're like, okay, is that all you got? And you're like, yeah, that's all I got. They are taking you to passive end range. They're like, relax, right? They tell you to don't do anything. Let me do it. Let me do it. That's them telling you to not actively do it. Let them passively do it for you. Leaning against the floor or wall to articulate end range of motion. So in stretching, quote unquote, well, we consider that if I lean against something, traditionally in yoga, we're leaning against the floor, that's going to be passive, that's going to be a passive action where I'm kind of pushing on the joint like that. And the last one, leaning against another body part to articulate end range of motion. So basically leaning against the body in a different way to articulate the end range. So instead of leaning against the wall or the floor like an inanimate object, you're now leaning against an object that is part of your body or something like that. So passive end range is basically external forces doing the work. Now yoga in general is passive stretching for the most part, especially yin yoga and other practices like that. It is basically all passive stretching. The problem with that is most people, right, they're going for it. They go to yoga and they go to these stretches and they're in it. Another way to think of it is vinyasa yoga isn't really passive, right? It's more dynamic or active or whatever you want to call it. So kind of especially a power vinyasa class, you're not really getting too much real, basic stretching. You're not getting that passive. Maybe at the end, in the beginning a little bit you might, but the whole class is not really focused on that. I'm going to go over active stretching and dynamic and loaded stretching in another episode, so know that. We're just touching on them. I don't want to confuse you, but passive stretching is the foundation, right? Without a good passive stretch, without knowing your passive end range and understanding how to create a passive stretch in your body, the other ones don't work too well. And the results will vary. And if you have an injury and you go to active and loaded stretching and you keep doing that, you could definitely hurt yourself. So it's something to think about. It's not like you don't want a passive stretch. Everyone's like, oh, yoga's only passive stretching, but that's the beginning, right? You need it like a percentage. It's like, I need passive, active, dynamic, loaded, right? Then you're full strength. But we'll get into that. We'll incrementally go through that in these episodes. All right, so I said you need passive end range to find, we use sacred geometry to find passive end range. And then basically you need to feel a stretch. So, I mean, there's a couple different ways a stretch is defined. A very basic way is it's undoing what the muscle does, could be considered a stretch. But the more technical definition is a manipulation of the meiotic reflex. And that's abbreviated and called the stretch reflex. This is like if you've ever used a car at like an amusement park, or like had something with a governor on it where you can't go super fast and it stops you from going too far. The stretch reflex is like that in your body. It understands where you're safe and it doesn't let you go too far. So that's the feeling of the stretch. So when you're extending a joint through a range, whether it's passive, active, or loaded, doesn't even matter, dynamic, the stretch reflex is a point where it kind of fights back a little bit and tells you that there is something going on there. It signals you. Let's read what it says. The stretch reflex, also called the meiotic reflex, is the signal or trigger to resist a change in muscle length as it stretches to the available end range. So basically what I said, it's regulating that. It's mediating polarities to resist where you are. It's telling you how to find, where the stretch is. Perfect. So you have the stretch reflex, and you basically stay there. And what most people don't understand, and I didn't even understand, is that you have to be at the stretch reflex for anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to, 120. Anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes, depending on if it's the first time you've extended that joint today, how much you've extended it on the daily. There's a lot of other factors. But in order for a passive stretch to work, in order for your nervous system to understand that you're stretching, you need to be in that position for an extended period of time. Your body is dynamic, it runs on dynamic systems theory, like it's ready for action. So in order to calm it down, that's you taking the time to tell it to calm down. There's only one way to talk to your body, right? I mean, of course, you can mentally project down, and like connect and do your yoga in other ways. But when it comes to the science, there's only one way to physically connect, and that's through tension or force, like the FRC guys say, which I love their stuff, and I always talk about it. Force is the language of the cells. So when you touch yourself, right, you feel it. That's the tissue responding. And think of it this way, right? You can like barely touch yourself and you can feel that, or you can push hard and you can also feel that. So you can feel a lot. It's a language in your body. Now, when you stretch, it's no different. You're extending ranges. There are sensations, right? You might feel that the stretch reflex kicks in real quick. And the stretch reflex is dynamic too. So if you go real quick in an extended range, it'll kick in real quick to protect you from injury. That's a big part of it. Like if you got pulled into a split or something and you weren't ready for it, that stretch reflex would likely kick in and keep you from going there, or at least stop a big injury. Like it wouldn't let you get crushed. Cool. All right, so the stretch reflex, I'm hoping you understand what that is. There's more information here. I'm not going to go into that now. Obviously, I want you to buy the book. It's all technical anyway. I don't want to waste your time. But that brings us, right? And like I said, you need to do it for 1 to 2 minutes to really feel it. We're going to demo that in the pose breakdowns anyway, so don't worry. We're going to go over all that. But what you really need to understand is how does this affect, right? You get to the stretch reflex, you're still not in a stretch, right? You do it for the minute or two, and yeah, then you're in a stretch, I guess, right? But no, there's something more. There's something that comes after that. So you have the stretch reflex kicks in, then you wait. This is what people commonly refer to as like calming the nervous system, right? You need to calm the nervous system in yoga. You want to get out of that fight or flight. And when you get to the stretch reflex, that's kind of your that is your fight or flight, right? It's your body like, whoa, I'm not ready to go that far. And it kicks in, and then you're like, all right, let's stay here for a minute or two, goose fraba. And you get that leg to release, or whatever joint you're working with. After 2 minutes, then something happens called the inverse meiotic reflex, which we also refer to as the lengthening reaction. The lengthening reaction, also called the inverse meiotic reflex, prevents the muscles from contracting at end range, causing them to relax. This is the signal to override the stretch reflex. And there you have it. That is a textbook passive stretch, right? You create the end range. Well, technically the way I said it, you use sacred geometry, whatever that is, that concept. You find passive end range safely. Then once you're in passive end range, you stay there, right? Once you have that stretch reflex kick in at passive end range, because that's what happens when you get to passive end range, the stretch reflex kicks in. 1 to 2 minutes there, you feel something happening, right? The tissue is adjusting. I don't know. It's something personal. That's what happens. And that's called the lengthening reaction. And that is the textbook scientific stretch. I hope it makes sense. I hope I explained it really nice. But if I didn't, you should get the book. YogaFramework.com. You should get the book. Also, coming up, as we go further, what is mobility? And this is where we'll talk about the other types of stretching. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Because passive stretching is, as I do more yoga, I realize I didn't understand passive stretching until like a year ago, which can sound crazy. Because I've been teaching yoga for like 8 to 10 years, and it's not like I didn't understand it, I did, but to the extent of what I do now, it's a lot different. So I explain it a lot differently, and in my classes, I actually teach a lot differently. So what's next? What do we have up next? Time under tension. Now that brings us to the next part, right? That 60 to 90 seconds, that's that time under tension. And we covered some of this actually, but brings us to that next part of the lengthening reaction that we talked about and how to use the stretching in general, right? So in everything you do, this feeling I'm talking about, this, I don't want to give it a name. Like I said, the stretch reflex, the weight at the lengthening reaction, we can classify all that under time under tension. We can just classify that as that. So basically you find passive end range, spend time under tension until you feel something, right? You don't have to go into all the details of what the actual stretch is, but it's really what we refer to as an all-encompassing time under tension. And this is true with not just passive stretching, but this is going to relate over to active and loaded stretching as well. So it's important to understand that when people say time under tension, they are referring to a broken down technical stretch, which I just explained earlier, right? It's just the same thing. This is the terminology. I want you to be familiar with that. Cool, let's go on to the cue myth. All right, let me make sure I have that set up nicely. Okay, the cue myth. Today's cue, it has to do with passive stretching. But it's kind of like it's about a cue that we commonly hear all the time. So what is the cue? Downward dog is a resting pose. So this is something I've heard since the beginning of yoga that I took it in the first class. This is what everyone, or at least a lot of the teachers I took, were saying, because that's what happens. You tend to, if you go to a studio, cues tend to be passed around, and it's like the best cues kind of stay around, and it's like becomes a little like cue pool, and then everyone's just saying the same things, and it's kind of lame as well on a different level if you're practicing a lot, but whatever. That's why it's important to understand the articulations and everything and come up with your own stuff. But downward dog is a resting pose. A lot of people say this. Based on what you just learned or what I just talked about with passive stretching, is downward dog a resting pose? I'll just give you some time. We'll treat this like the pop quiz since I messed the other one up. I mean, we can think of it, right? Passive stretching is you find the passive end range, because a resting pose would be a passive stretch, I believe. That's what I would classify that as. So if I find the passive end range in downward dog, I guess that would be in my hamstrings. Okay, yeah, my legs probably. And then I just wait for 2 minutes, and then the lengthening reaction happens. Okay, well, that happens for all of them. But for passive, let's say it's relaxed, right? I'm not doing the work. I don't know. Let's break it down. So it comes down to being not passive, and basically because it's active and loaded. So I guess it was a little bad example to break it down to the lengthening reaction, all that, because that, like I said, that happens in every stretch. But the whole passive part of it, the waiting, right? We're not really waiting in downward dog. We're loading, and we're active in that loading. Because if we were waiting, we would be able to stay there, right? We're not like, we're not using a lot of effort. That's the passive, right? Think of passive stretching like passive income. It comes just on its own. Like after you've done the initial setup, it kind of just keeps going. You don't have to worry about losing that income, or you're not likely to necessarily lose that income. So passive income, passive stretching, similar. Downward dog is not a passive stretch. It's not a resting pose because you're working in it, right? You have to work to hold downward dog very hard with your body, pushing backwards and other aspects of the load pushing against the ground. So that's why downward dog doesn't qualify as a resting pose. The whole idea of the passive stretch, I keep going over, this whole thing is about passive stretching, right? The stretch is the concept, but the passive stretch is the idea of you waiting, right? The time under tension. and you're chilling. So remember, it can always be used for other stretches. All right, let's keep moving along. And I don't want to confuse you because, you know, there are many, you know, there are 3 or 4 different types of stretching we're going to go over, and they all encompass the stretch reflex, lengthening reaction, you know, the time to a degree. Passive stretching is more the time, but also active could be the time too. And then they also, in different ways, like they all incorporate, let's say, time under tension in different ways. But what I want you to clearly understand is that passive stretching is relaxed, right? It's the one where you're not trying. You're not giving it effort. It's passive, like the income, right? You don't work for passive income, technically. You're not supposed to work for the passive stretch. You're supposed to just set it up and kind of let it do the job. You know, you work a little, you maintenance it. That's a better way to think of it. You maintenance a passive stretch, but you don't necessarily work for it. This will become more clear in the pose breakdown. So let's just go to the pose breakdown and let's begin to go over that. Okay. Love that I'm making that pucker face. All right, today's pose breakdown: half split and pyramid. So if you know those, that's what we're doing. They're similar. I'm just getting ready here. Excuse my inability or my noviceness, my green. What articulations are in half split? All right, so the first one we have is hip flexion. That is a fold, textbook. So when you talk about a fold, which a half split, you know, mostly, well, let's say runner's lunge, we'll call it, because I mean, it is half split in yoga, but it's runner's lunge. That is a fold first, just like downward dog and a lot of these other poses are folds in the hip foremost. Hip flexion. What do we have next? Just like every other fold, we have knee extension. Knee extension is important, but it's secondary. Hip flexion is always the primary. Knee extension is the secondary. So in any fold, especially these two, half split and pyramid, we're going to look for hip flexion first, then knee extension. And I know you're probably thinking, well, in a split, isn't it more the legs and not the fold? And yeah, it could be, but for safety and flexibility and for the muscles that are actually used in the pose, you want to do it this way. And I'll show you as we go over that more. All right, there is one more articulation, and this kind of ties into what I just said. It's in the spine. Let's just put, there we go. It's extension and flexion. So what happens is in your spine, like I said, in the split, you can come up and extend. And even in pyramid, right, you can extend your spine. And then you can also flex. In the folding episode, if you didn't check that out, like if you have pain in forward folds, that was like one of the first episodes I did. I talk about how the fold is twofold, right? In yoga, many of the folds require you to do something with your spine as the last priority. So if you can't find that as everything else first, you wouldn't use your spine. That's where you would remain in extension. But that's kind of where I'm going with all this. So we're going to go over the half split. We're going to go over pyramid pose. These poses are very similar. They're both stretching the front leg. Pyramid pose in Sanskrit is Parsvottanasana, and it stands for extreme side stretch or intense side stretch, and that's talking about your leg. And half split or Ardha Hanuman that's just a split. And if you know a split, that's a huge stretch in your hamstrings and your front leg. But if you don't have that room and you extend, and you can mess it up. So without further ado, let's head over to the studio, which I hope you can notice I created a little bit of a better setup. All right, I'm gonna just pop on over there because that's what I could do. Boom. All right, welcome to the studio. Welcome to Yoga Framework Studio Edition. Today we're going to be talking about the half split and pyramid pose. And these poses are going to be stretching your front legs, like I just said. So I'm going to start out in half Hanuman, or Ardha Hanuman, or half split. And what I'm going to do with this is I'll tilt my other leg forward so you can see better. I'm going to keep my hands in line with the foot. And I'm going to work hip flexion first. Remember we said first priority, hip flexion. So you start in the lunge, you already have hip flexion. Your hip is closed in the front hip. That's the fold, because both these poses are only working with one leg at a time. So you're only flexing one side of the hip at a time. And then I'll come back and extend my leg a little bit until I feel it. And that's it, right? I don't have to go further. And I could almost do a split, but this is where I feel passive and range. And when I talked about sacred geometry, I could have my knee by my armpit here, hand in line with the foot. And as long as those stay in line, I won't go beyond passive and range. Hint, hint. If you're not sure, reduce. So pull it in a little bit. Extend your spine, right? If you're not sure, if you want less. And remember I said you can like literally tickle, right? You can just kind of tickle the foot to feel it. That means that when you do a stretch, just tickle the tissue a little bit. You barely want to feel it. It's not like you're not going to do a real stretch, quote unquote, whatever that is. But passive stretching is not that. This is what I'm talking about. It is this minimalist stretching. I'm just finding the end range and I'm waiting, right? I've been here like almost a minute, maybe more. I'm not even going to do spinal flex. I mean, I could actually. I could spinal flex like a dead bug over it. That's okay. First priority, hip flexion, knee extension, then spinal flexion. Doesn't mean I need to go full tilt on all of them. And I could be in this position for a while. That's how minimal the stretch is. That's the idea. I'm not pushing. I'm passive. I found the passive end range. I'm at the stretch reflex. I could feel the automatic contraction of these muscles kicking in. And I'm just waiting for them to decrease a little bit. Or, no, I'm sorry, for them to lengthen a little bit. All right, now let's lightly come out of this. And because I took that time in the passive end range, I can then easier come into the same stretch with more of an active component. And that's the pyramid. All right, so you could, I wouldn't really consider this a passive stretch, even though, even though it could be because you're using the floor a lot. I mean, I guess it's really relative. When you're standing, you're adding an element of activity in my mind, right? So when we go into active stretching, we're going to talk a lot about decreasing the weight that's, the external forces. But in my mind, right, if we're going to really go technical, there was no external force here. I'm waiting. I found it. It's cool. I'm chill. When I come into pyramid, though, I've now included an external force called gravity. You know, just this is now a lot more in my leg. I can feel it. And my hands work harder to support. It makes it, you know, still passive, but it's got a passive active element. And if I really wanted to go active, I would begin to, you know, lift this hand, go fingertips. That's a little more active. That's completely active, actually. And this is where we're touching on where we're going in the next few episodes, how it's going to go into passive, active, dynamic stretching, and how you need to understand all of that to really have an efficient yoga, mobility, life, movement practice. That's what this is about. This isn't about just going to yoga class or keen stretch class or whatever your little stretch modality, mobility, love, and Ido Portal thing is, right? You really want to understand the framework behind everything. And this is the building block for everything, passive stretching. You got to get it, right? I'm going to go over it real quick. I mean, we're not going to do the 2-minute hold, but I'm going to go over the concepts real quick. One more time. I found a lunge. I used sacred geometry with my hands, shoulder and the knee. Then I found end range. Using that sacred geometry, that was my passive end range, and now I feel the stretch reflex here in my leg, my hamstrings, not in my back. If I felt it in my back, I would bend my knee more. Right? Another thing you have to think about is where is the stretch? In these two stretches, it's in your leg when we were doing the lunge and pyramid, right? And then you tuck your toe, don't step on your glasses, and then you find pyramid pose. Now I said this is passive, but a little more active because, you know, you're standing, gravity. It's definitely got a little more of an active component. It's not fully passive. And as I decrease the use of my hand, I'm making it more active, right? Well, let's not just think of like, it has to be hands lifted to be active. You are decreasing the amount of tension externally, right, that you're bringing in to help to create a more active position than where you are now. You can create a more passive position as well. So it's not even as clearly defined as hands down, hands up. I mean, in a very layman's term, you could say that, but that's not what we would consider fully passive, fully active. And that's an example where you can see that it's not as concrete. Cool. I hope you got some out of those demos and the idea. And I didn't do a lot of range, if you noticed. I can do a split, no problem, right? Not that I have to prove it with my ego. But the passive stretch for me was really the way. And to be honest, if I didn't do those passive stretches, I wouldn't have felt good doing that. Or I wouldn't have felt at least comfortable, right? I would have been probably a little on my edge. And this is where a lot of injuries happen, is you don't do the passive stretching first. You don't wait the 2 minutes for each major muscle group. And then you go out there and you go crazy. On the flip side, if you're lifting weights, you don't want to do this. You don't want to stretch before lifting heavy weights. So let's just make that clear. So like if you go to CrossFit a lot and you stretch a lot before CrossFit, I would advise against that. Maybe I would advise some light tissue work if you needed it. But another story for another day. All right. Back in the saddle. All right, cool. I hope you thought it was cool. I hope you enjoyed the passive stretching breakdown. Again, it's all from the book because I got tired of not, explaining it perfectly every time. So I wrote it down. I was like, this is the perfect way that I want to convey the information. It is according to a modern yoga-ish practice, but let's face it, every stretch is similar to yoga. I mean, what makes, many people argue that the movement isn't the yoga. You could argue the opposite, saying that every other modality is the yoga as well. So it's relative. Also, the deck, the yoga card deck. Check it out. This is only available on my website. The book right now is still available on Amazon.com. The cards I sold out on Amazon.com. I do still have more though. I'm gonna hold on to them for now. I'm not gonna send them to Amazon. So order on yogaframework.com if you want them. I'm Jeff. This is Yoga Framework. And every week I teach you how to create a better yoga and mobility practice. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for dealing with me learning streaming still. If you're still coming back, I love you even more. Have a wonderful day.